So this is for your collar and your facing application on the front. You want to remember to put your pockets onto your front jackets before you construct the shell of your jacket, meaning before you attach your fronts to your backs. This is because it's going to be a lot easier if you have a flat state of your fronts to find the positioning of the pockets on your front. After your pockets are applied to the front, you're going to stitch your fronts to your backs so your neckline is complete. Right? So right now I have the neckline for just the wearer's right side. I have the half, but you're going to have the entire neckline. This shoulder is pinned together right now, so it might look a little bit weird, but yours should be stitched together and pressed open, so seam allowances pressed back on themselves. The collar needs to be fully constructed before you can put it into the neckline. So that means you have stitched it together at center back for the undercollar. You've stitched your upper collar to your undercollar, and you've understitched the seam allowance to the undercollar. So you have that turner cloth and the seam pushed towards the undercollar. That's so it is concealing that seam when the collar lives as it will, and you see the upper collar. Okay, your collar should be diagonal basted in place. This turner cloth, keep it in place because there's still a lot of potential for shifting around when you're applying this collar to the neckline. So diagonal baste this at the top, meaning the collar edge or style line of your collar, or the straight edge and the collar point. Baste together your neckline. This machine stitch that you see is a stay stitch that is applied right after you cut out your collar pieces. So now our collar is completely constructed. It's ready to go into the neckline. The way you're going to place this into your neckline is exactly how it's going to live when the jacket's fully constructed. So right here, I have the tailor tack for your collar punch hole. You could also call this the gorge notch. It does not line up right with your center front line. It's right over from it. This is where the finished edge of your collar is going to line up when you're placing this to your neckline. So with my upper collar facing upward and the good side of my jacket front up as well, I'm going to start aligning the cut edges, the seam allowances of my collar to my neckline with the finished edge right at the same position as this tailor tack for my gorge punch hole, my collar punch hole. So pin this in, walking around this neckline. It's going to be a little bit hard to fit these two opposite curves together. Just walk around this neckline, and you can use your notches that you have tailor tacked to align everything. That notch should line up with the notch on your neckline, the higher up notch. And then the second notch in should line up with the shoulder seam that you just created by stitching your front to your back. Seam allowances for the shoulder seam should be pressed flat like this and should align right with that notch. You also have a center back notch that should align right with the center back seam of your two back pieces. So continue pinning that in place. Make sure you are paying attention to the cut edges of the seam allowance and distribute that curve appropriately into the opposite curve of the jacket neckline. Once you have that completely pinned in place, you're going to stitch that down at 3/8 of an inch. So not our full 1/2 inch seam allowance, but 3/8 from the edge. You're going to stitch that down. Back stitch, back tack when you start, and stop. Okay, let's say that our collar now is stitched in place, right? we're using the two layers of the collar as one piece. It's not like our other collar projects in that we stitch one side of our collar to the shell of our garment and then we turn the other side of our seam allowance to finish it off. We are stitching both layers of this, and that's why we basted it at the bottom, so they act as one piece. And now we can stitch it as one piece to the neckline. So now we have this in the neckline of our jacket. The collar is applied. Now we can do the facing. You can only do the facing once your collar is in the neckline. With your project, just like this, just like we've been working with. Front of your jacket is facing upward. Upper collar is also facing upward, just how it's going to live. Place your facing piece, good to good, on your jacket front. So here's our facing piece, the one with a little J on the bottom. Stay stitch this area at 3/8 and stay stitch this neckline right here. This should already be done, but if you didn't do it already, go ahead and do it. I'm going to place this good to good, lining up my edges. Remember that we have a turn of cloth on this lapel edge. And this turn of cloth is different than the turn of cloth on the collar because we have the turn of cloth changing right where the break point is. It's going to switch over from existing on one side and it's going to go over to the other side. Before you can do anything with your turn of cloth though, we need to stitch the facing onto the front of the jacket. Now as you can see where I'm pinning, I am sandwiching that collar, those two layers of the collar that we just stitched to the neckline. I'm sandwiching that in between this facing and the jacket. You're not going to stitch this facing all the way up the neckline. What you're going to do once you get it pinned in place, edges meeting each other perfectly, everything looks fine. You're going to stitch this all the way up this front lapel edge at 1/2 inch seam allowance, just our normal seam allowance. You can unfold the seam allowance that attaches your center front piece to your side front piece. Unfold the seam allowance of your center front piece and line that up with the edge of your facing piece, just like this. See how I unfolded the seam allowance right there? And that will give us access all the way to stitch to the edge of this. Pin really well as you need it so that curve doesn't move around. Once you get it fully pinned, you're going to stitch that just like we were talking about, 1/2 inch all the way up. Make this corner nice and sharp. Drop your needle from the machine into this corner and pivot so you get that nice crisp corner right there. Continue stitching at that 1/2 inch seam allowance around the neckline. And because we stitched our collar at 3/8 of an inch, this new 1/2 inch seam allowance that we're stitching at is going to enclose this stitch right here, that previous one. You're not going to stitch this all the way down though. You see this notch, the notch that aligned very closely with the roll line, where the roll line intersected with our neckline. That's where you want to stop. So just back tack when you get to that notch. You see, here's where all my other notches are, so I'm gonna make that notch live right with those other ones. And the reason why we're not stitching this all the way down is because we need to later attach this to the lining pieces, and then we're going to continue this stitch. We're going to pick it back up after the lining is attached to this facing, and we can stitch the entire neckline, including the facing, and with the remainder of the remainder of the facing plus the lining. So we have this 1/2 inch stitch all the way down now. How do you get that changeover in your turn of cloth at the break point? You should have a tailor tack for a notch at the break point. That's right here. Your break point is always going to live a little bit above your buttonhole position. So trim down your seam allowance to 1/4. Try to do a fat quarter. You don't want to go so small that it's hard to manipulate that seam allowance, but trim it down to a fat quarter. So everything above, this is how we're going to get this turn of cloth. Everything above the break point, the seam allowance is going to get stitched to the jacket front side. So your understitch is going to live on the jacket side for everything above the break point. So I'm pushing the seam allowance so it lives with the front of the jacket. And then when we get to the break point, what you're going to do with the seam allowance is make a tiny little snip perpendicularly to your seam that you just made to finish off your lapel edge. And that's going to release the top side of your seam allowance from the bottom side of your seam allowance. Because we are pushing our seam allowance toward the jacket front for the top part, we need to flip our seam allowance toward the facing side, which means this side, for everything below the break point. And it's just a normal understitch, but you're doing it by hand, which means you want your majority of your traveling to happen on the interior of the garment, and you'll see a tiny prick stitch on the finished edge. And continue that all the way down to the bottom edge so you can seal the seam on the bottom when it's attached like this. This is a better example right here. Here's our lapel edge, right? And here's our jacket front. Here's the facing that gets stitched to the jacket front, and it lives folded over like this. That folded edge is called our roll line. And where that roll line hits the edge of our lapel is the break point. Okay? So that break point is where this turn of cloth should change over. So right here, I can see my seam. This is the top of my lapel, and at this break point, it changes over to the bottom edge. See, if I flip it over, I can see the seam. And it's because this lapel lives like this. Makes sense now.